22 years of building custom homes in southern Ontario will teach you one thing that no business school course ever puts into plain language. The person who arrives at a conversation already holding the exit is the one who has already decided the conversation does not matter. My brother-in-law arrived at our kitchen table that way. He had already decided. I just hadn't been told yet. My name is Patrick Aldous. I am 47 years old. I grew up in Brantford, Ontario, the kind of city where everyone knows what your father did for a living and expects you to either match it or explain yourself. My father, Gerald Aldous, was a Finnish carpenter for 31 years. He retired in 2019 at 68, collected his pension from the Carpenters Union, and moved into the house on Colborne Street, where he had lived since 1988. Where my mother had lived until she passed in 2021, where I had grown up and where he had no intention of leaving. He said this clearly and often. I have my tools in the garage and your mother's garden in the backyard, and I don't need anyone to manage me. He was not wrong about any of that, but then he fell in February 2022. Not a serious fall, not the kind that changes everything overnight, but the kind that introduces a question that cannot be unasked. He was on the back porch clearing ice and his left knee went, and he sat down hard on the steps and couldn't get up without holding the railing with both hands. He called me instead of an ambulance, which I took as a good sign about his pride and a less good sign about his judgment. I drove from Hamilton in 40 minutes. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coat still on and a cup of tea he hadn't touched yet. I'm fine, he said before I was through the door. You called me at 7 in the morning. I didn't want to bother you at 6. That was Gerald. 22 years of watching him operate, and the man had never once asked for something directly. He asked sideways, through jokes, through understatement, through the specific silence of a man who had spent his whole life providing for people and had never quite figured out how to be on the receiving end. My wife, Sandra, was the one who brought it up first. Sandra is 45 and works as an occupational therapist at a clinic in Ancaster. She is measured where I am reactive, patient where I am quick, and she has the particular professional gift of being able to say difficult things in a tone of voice that makes them sound like obvious next steps rather than upheaval. We should talk to your dad about coming to stay with us for a while, she said that evening. At least through the winter. He shouldn't be managing that house alone on ice. I agreed. Not immediately. The way you agree when something has already been true for a while and someone finally says it out loud. My father was 71 years old and lived alone in a 3-bedroom house and had just spent a February morning sitting on an icy porch step in his coat, unable to stand. The conversation with him took 3 weeks. Not because he was difficult, but because he was Gerald Aldous. And Gerald Aldous required time to arrive at a decision through his own route before he would accept that he had arrived. By March, he was in our spare room on Ravenswood Crescent in Ancaster, with his tools in our garage, his union pension deposited into his own account at the TD branch on Wilson Street, and a savings balance he had never discussed with me directly, but which I understood to be substantial, the accumulated careful living of 2 people who had owned their home outright, driven the same vehicles for 11 years, and taken exactly 1 vacation per decade. He had not sold the Colborne Street house. He had rented it to a young couple from Brantford who paid once a month and took good care of the garden, which mattered to him. The rental income went into his own account. We did not discuss it. He was not a financial burden. I want to be clear about that because it becomes relevant later in a way that made me angrier the more I thought about it. My father contributed to the household the way men of his generation contribute, not with a check, but with his hands. He regrouted the master bathroom before the end of his first week. He rebuilt the gate on our side fence that had been sagging since we bought the house and that I had been meaning to get to for 2 years. He built a raised garden bed in the backyard for Sandra, without being asked. From cedar he sourced himself from a lumber yard on Nebo Road because cedar holds up better in Ontario winter, and he had opinions about this. Sandra called it the nicest thing anyone had ever done for her vegetable garden. My father said it was just correct construction and she shouldn't read into it. He was 71 years old and he was, by any accounting, an asset to that household. I knew it. Sandra knew it. The only person who saw it differently was Sandra's brother, Ryan Beckett. He and his wife, Cassandra, 40, live in a newer build in Stony Creek, a house they bought in 2020 at what Ryan described at the time as a negotiated price, and what I understood to mean their parents contributed to the down payment. Ryan works in equipment leasing, which he describes at every family dinner in more detail than the subject requires. He is the kind of person who arrives at other people's houses, already performing comfort, already occupying the room, already explaining things to you in your own home. I had managed a cordial relationship with him for 17 years by treating him the way you treat a slightly unreliable subcontractor. Acknowledge the work, check it twice, don't give him the load-bearing jobs. I should have remembered that rule. It was a Thursday evening in November 2023. My father had been with us for 20 months. Sandra and I were at her book club, which meets at the Roselawn Community Center, and which I attend because Sandra asks me to, and because the wine is good, and because I like the people. My father had stayed home. He went to bed early on Thursdays because he played cards on Friday mornings at the Legion Hall on Hayw 53 with 3 men he had known since the 1990s, and he treated his sleep before cards with the seriousness of a professional obligation. Ryan and Cassandra had come over unannounced, which they did with a frequency that I had discussed with Sandra privately, and which Sandra had not yet addressed with Ryan, because addressing things with Ryan required a specific kind of energy she reserved for moments when she had enough of it. When we got home, Ryan was in our kitchen. Not unusual. He had a key, which Sandra had given him years ago and which I had not rescinded, because that is the kind of minor conflict I prefer to avoid. What was unusual was the expression on his face when we walked in. He had the look of a man who had been building toward a conversation and had just run out of patience with the building. He said he had run into Dad on the way to the bathroom. He said they had talked for a while. He said he had been thinking about our situation and wanted to share some thoughts. I poured myself a glass of water. Sandra sat down. I did not sit down, which was a choice. Ryan said that he and Cassandra had been doing some calculations. He said that with the cost of living in Ontario, the carrying costs of the house, property taxes, utilities, groceries, he and Sandra had looked at what it actually cost to house an additional person for a full year. He had a figure in mind. He said he wanted to discuss what a reasonable contribution might look like going forward. I looked at Ryan. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment because it was not simple. It was the particular compound feeling of recognizing something you had not seen coming, even though, once you saw it, it was entirely predictable. How much? I said. Ryan mentioned a number. He suggested that my father contribute $1,500 per month toward household expenses, retroactive in spirit if not in fact, going forward immediately, deducted from what he called his passive income, meaning the rental on Colborne Street, and supplemented if necessary from his savings. He used the phrase passive income, about my father's pension and rental income, about the money my father had spent 31 years earning with his hands. Sandra's face was very still. This is Sandra's face when she is deciding how angry she is before she decides how to respond. I have known this face for 19 years. I said. Ryan, this is the first I'm hearing of this. I wanted to bring it up when you were both here. He opened his hands in the particular gesture of a man who considers himself reasonable. It's just a conversation. I looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at me. My father was down the hall, asleep, 11 feet from where Ryan was sitting in our kitchen, explaining what my father owed for the privilege of sleeping in our spare room. I said that Sandra and I needed to discuss this privately and thanked Ryan for coming by. The phrase came out flatter than I intended, which I did not attempt to correct. Ryan read the room finally, and he and Cassandra left within 10 minutes. I heard his truck back out of the driveway. Sandra and I stood in the kitchen for a long moment without saying anything. Then Sandra said, very quietly, he didn't talk to me first. I know. He came here when we weren't home and talked to your dad about money. I know. I found out later. Not from Sandra and not from my father, but from Cassandra, who told Sandra over the phone the following week in a tone that suggested she thought she was explaining something obvious. Ryan had spoken to my father directly, had sat down with him in the living room, had laid out the math, and had told him that while they were glad he was comfortable, a contribution of this size was reasonable given current costs. He had used the word reasonable 4 times, according to my father, who mentioned this to me later with the dry precision of a man who has spent a long life noticing when someone is working too hard to justify themselves. He told me what you'd pay for a room in Hamilton these days, my father said. He printed it off from a website. He printed it. 3 pages. He had a highlighter. My father said this without emotion, in the same tone he used to discuss lumber pricing. But I had known him for 47 years and I knew what that tone cost him. I did not make any decisions that night. I have learned this the hard way, through 2 decades of running a construction business, where decisions made on a bad afternoon have a way of becoming expensive. I went to the garage instead. I have a workbench out there and I do my best thinking with my hands on something real. I stood at that bench for a long time. The next morning I called my friend Derek Lawson. Derek is 49 and ran a small property management company out of Hamilton for 15 years before he sold it and retired early to a place on the Niagara Escarpment. He is the kind of person who has seen enough of how money and family intersect to have opinions worth hearing. And he answers his phone on the first ring when he recognizes my number, which is the mark of a real friend. I told him what had happened, concisely, because Derek does not require setup. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does Sandra know Ryan did this without telling her?" "Yes." "What does she want to do?" "I don't know yet, but I know what I want to do." Derek made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "What arrangement does your dad have in writing?" "Nothing in writing." Derek said nothing for a moment that was long enough to be an answer. Then he said, "You know he has residential rights, your dad. He's been there 20 months, even without a lease. In Ontario, a person who has been living in a property with the owner's knowledge and permission for that long is a tenant in the legal sense. You can't just tell him to leave, or charge him retroactively. The Residential Tenancies Act is fairly clear on this. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I had thought about it as a family situation, which I now understood was precisely the framing Ryan had been counting on. "I knew," I said. "I just hadn't framed it that way." "Frame it that way," Derek said. "Then decide what you actually want." What I actually wanted was to handle this in a way that protected my father without blowing up Sandra's family, which is a narrower target than it sounds. Sandra and Ryan are close, in the complicated way of siblings who are different enough to generate friction and similar enough to keep returning to each other. I did not want to make Sandra choose, but I also understood that Ryan had walked into our home with a highlighted printout and sat down with my father and discussed his retirement savings, and that this could not simply be absorbed. Sandra and I talked that evening after my father went to bed. We talked for 2 hours at the kitchen table, the same table Ryan had been sitting at the night before, and by the end of it we had agreed on 2 things. 1, my father would not be contributing $1,500 a month or any amount to a household he had been invited into, and in which he had been, by any reasonable measure, a substantial asset. 2, Sandra would speak to Ryan directly and make this clear. Sandra's conversation with Ryan happened on a Saturday. I was not there. I stayed home with my father, and we spent the morning in the garage, reorganizing the lumber rack, which had been driving him quietly mad since September. When Sandra came home, she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface, the way she does when she wants to be precise about something. She said Ryan had apologized, that he hadn't realized how it had come across, that he had thought he was helping. She said this the way you report information you are not fully endorsing. "Did he understand that he went directly to Dad?" I said. "Yes." And she looked at her hands for a moment. He said Dad seemed open to the conversation. I thought about my father, 71 years old, sitting in our living room with a highlighted printout, being told what a room in Hamilton cost. He was being polite, I said. He spent 31 years being polite to people who had more authority than him in a given room. "It's a reflex," Sandra nodded. She already knew this. The thing that did not resolve cleanly, the thing I was left with after Ryan's apology and Sandra's report, and the return to ordinary dinners and a careful resumption of ordinary family life, was the question of my father's situation in the longer term. He was 71, he had a bad knee. He was in our spare room, which he had never intended to be permanent, and which was, I suspected, beginning to feel that way to him in a manner he would not say directly. I raised it with him in December, in the garage, which is where we talk about things that matter. He was sanding a small cabinet he was building for a neighbor down the street, a woman named Patricia Okafor, 68, who had admired his workmanship on the garden bed through the fence and asked if he did commissions. He had said he didn't do commissions, but he could build her something if she told him what she needed. I said, "Dad, what do you actually want? Not what's convenient, not what's easiest for everyone. What do you want?" He kept sanding. He has a way of answering questions with more silence than words, which I have always understood as the seriousness with which he takes them. Then he said, "I want my own front door. I want a place where I put the key in the lock and it's mine. That's what I had known this was the answer. I had known it the way you know something that has been true for a while but needed to be said before it became real. My father was not a man who was made for spare rooms. He was made for his own garage, and his own tools hung in his own order on his own wall, and his own coffee in the morning in his own kitchen, without navigating anyone else's schedule. In January, I called Miriam Vautour, Miriam is 54 and has been the top residential agent in Ancaster for going on 12 years. She sold us our house on Ravenswood Crescent, and she is the kind of realtor who sends you a card on your anniversary and actually knows what you paid for the property the last time it turned over. She had 4 listings in my father's range before the end of the week. I told my father I had made some calls. He said he hadn't asked me to do that. I said I know. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "How many listings?" 4. He looked at his coffee. All right. We walked through 3 of them over 2 weekends. The first 2 were fine in the disheartening way of houses that meet the requirements without meeting the person. The third one stopped us both. A bungalow on Glendale Avenue North in Hamilton, a 12-minute drive from Ravenswood Crescent. The garage was double, which mattered, and the lot backed onto a ravine that had a particular stillness in January that I can only describe as the kind of quiet that belongs to a place that has not been hurried. The kitchen wanted work. The back door stuck in its frame. My father opened and closed it twice. Not to test it, I realized, but to understand it, the way he understands things, through his hands. The garden was overgrown. Not badly, not beyond reclaiming, but enough that it needed someone who knew what they were doing and intended to be there for a while. My father stood at the back window looking at the ravine. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would have liked that tree." There was a large silver maple at the far edge of the property, older than the house by the look of it, and bare in January, but with the particular architecture of a tree that knows how to be a tree without help. We put the offer in that afternoon. Cash purchase, no conditions, which is what 20 months of rental income and a pension and a lifetime of being careful with money makes possible when you have kept it in your own account with your own name on it. Miriam called the next morning. "It's his," she said, "his." I called my father at the card game on Friday. He stepped outside to take it. I told him. There was a long pause, the kind that has weight in it. He said, "All right." That's all he said. But I have known my father for 47 years, and I know that "all right," said in that particular register, is as close as he gets to the thing he actually means. He moved into Glendale Avenue North on the last weekend of February. I rented a trailer and borrowed Derek's truck, and my father's friend Ted McKenzie, 73, a retired electrician from Brantford who had known my father since 1991, showed up at 8 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and no announcement and carried boxes until noon. My father did not have much, for the same reason men like him never have much. Over a lifetime of building things that last, you stop accumulating. Things that don't. The tools went in first. That is not sentiment. That is priority. I want to tell you what I felt driving away from Glendale Avenue that afternoon, because this is not a story about triumph and I don't want to let it sound like one. My father was 72 years old, and he was in a house that was his, with a garage that was his, with a garden that needed him, 12 minutes from where his grandchildren would visit on weekends. That was good. That was genuinely good. But I also knew that something had cracked in our family that November, quietly, with a highlighted printout and a carefully rehearsed reasonable tone, and that you cannot uncrack those things. You can paper over them, or you can live alongside them, but they remain. I chose to live alongside it. I am not sure yet if that was wisdom or avoidance. I suspect it was some of both. My father had the back door fixed by Sunday morning, the kitchen faucet by Tuesday. He built a small cedar box for firewood on the side of the house before the end of the first week, because he had looked at the way the previous owner had stacked it and found it structurally indefensible. Patricia Okafor picked up the cabinet he'd left half-sanded in our garage and installed it herself, and sent him a note through us that said simply, "Beautiful work. Come for tea when you're settled." He went the following Thursday. 6 weeks after moving day, Ryan called me. Not Sandra, me, which I noted. His voice had a different quality than the November version, quieter, less organized. He said that he and Cassandra had been talking. He said he knew that what he'd done in November had not been right. He used the word right, not strategic, not mishandled, right. I gave him credit for that. He said, "I didn't think it through from your dad's perspective." No, I thought I was being practical. "You were being practical about someone else's retirement savings." A long pause. He said I'd like to apologize to him directly if he'd be open to it. I said I would ask. I did ask. My father was in the garage, fitting a new latch to the back gate. He listened to what I said without stopping what he was doing. Then he said he can come for coffee if he wants. I'll be here Saturday morning. Not a forgiveness speech, not a confrontation. Coffee on a Saturday morning in his own kitchen, in his own house, on his own terms. That is Gerald Aldous. Ryan came on Saturday. I didn't go. This is not false modesty. My father is 72 years old and spent 31 years handling his own work, and he did not need me standing behind him for a conversation with a 42-year-old man who had brought a highlighted printout to Hassan's kitchen. Sandra told me later that Ryan had come home quiet, that he'd stayed quiet through dinner, that he'd said Dad was a hell of a guy. Sandra said she'd agreed. I walked Glendale Avenue North on a Sunday afternoon in April. The silver maple was coming into leaf, slowly, and in the particular way of old maples that have no urgency, because they have been doing this longer than the people watching. My father was on the porch with a cup of coffee and a slight squint at the light. I walked up the front path. He poured me a cup without asking. We sat on the porch for an hour and said the kinds of things that don't need to be said aloud, but are worth saying anyway. About the maple. About the neighborhood, which is quiet and has a hardware store 8 minutes away that he had already located and assessed. About the garden, which he had started turning over tentatively, the way you approach something you intend to take seriously. He mentioned, without emphasis, that he had received a card from Patricia Okafor the previous Tuesday, that she had strong opinions about perennial borders, that she had apparently been right about the soil conditions along the south fence. I said that sounded promising. He said, "She is a good gardener. That is not nothing." Coming from Gerald Aldous, who does not distribute compliments loosely, that is a significant statement. Before I left, he walked me to the gate. He opened it to let me out, the new latch moving cleanly, the way it is supposed to, the way everything he touches eventually moves. He stood at the gate for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for making those calls." He had not asked me to. I know. I walked to my car and I did not look back because my father was standing at his own gate in front of his own house, and that is not the kind of thing you need to watch. You just need to know it's there. The journal I kept that winter has one entry I returned to. It is from the night I stood at my workbench after Ryan's visit in November, before I had made any decisions, when my blood was still warm and I was trying to think past it. It says 3 words. Dad deserves better. Everything that came after was just the work of making that true.